My mother said, "Rick deserves a fresh start more than you do," with such certainty that it made my stomach turn. As she nonchalantly discussed depositing my grandmother's $200,000 legacy straight into her boyfriend's account, I sat there in startled silence. Suddenly, the coffee cup seemed unbelievably heavy in my palm. "What do you mean, Mom?" I asked, even though I knew in my heart that the response would contradict all I believed to be true about our connection. "Juliet, he's gone through a lot. He lost everything in a cruel divorce. You're competent and youthful. You have the rest of your life to earn money." She said this without jeopardizing my financial future, as though she were talking about the weather. I'm 27 years old and go by Juliet Thompson. Here in Charleston, South Carolina, I am employed at Amberlin Ventures as a marketing coordinator. My dear grandma passed away 3 months ago, and I inherited her life savings. To me, it was more than simply money. It stood for her sacrifice, love, and faith in my future. She had particularly requested that I utilize money to launch my own business or as a down payment for a home. "That money was intended for me, Mom." In particular, Grandma said your grandmother would understand. She cut in, dismissively waving her hand. She always believed in helping family, and Rick is family now. Something seemed strange when I first met Rick, who had joined our family 8 months prior. He was sufficiently endearing to constantly send my mother flowers and compliment her cooking. However, there was something calculating about his generosity that made me shudder. He said he was a struggling contractor at 52, but I had never seen any real work. Besides, my mother went on, "You earn a respectable salary at your marketing position. Right now, Rick needs this more than you do." My heart was racing, but I made myself remain composed. "When did you transfer it?" "This morning. I wanted to let you know before the bank told you." She sounded as though she anticipated appreciation for this thought. I could tell how little she cared about my sentiments just by the cavalier manner she dropped this bombshell. This was not an impromptu choice. This was something she had likely planned for weeks. My fortune had just been stolen and given to a guy I hardly knew by the lady who had reared me and taught me the value of justice and honesty. But rather than blowing up, yelling, or sobbing, I had a completely other sensation, a chilly, calculated serenity that descended upon me. I grinned as I turned to face my mother, the person who had just betrayed me in the most basic way imaginable. "No issue, Mother. I am aware of your affection for him." Despite the difficulties of my early years, I had always felt that my mother and I had an unbreakable link. It was just the two of us against the world after my father departed when I was 12 years old. I did everything I could to be the ideal daughter, good grades, trouble-free, and always helpful around the house, while she worked multiple shifts as a nurse to keep us afloat. Our pillar of support during those trying times had been my grandma. She would invite me over for dinner every Sunday, giving me $20 notes when my mother wasn't looking, and sharing stories with me about how she started a little catering company from nothing. After leaving Ireland with just a bag and a desire, she ultimately saved enough money to pay for my mother's nursing education and purchase a modest home. Education and independence, she'd say to me, "Those are the only things no one can take away from you, darling." I believed I had shed all of my tears when Mom died of cancer last spring. Her lawyer then read the will after the modest yet lovely burial. I anticipated that my mother would get the home, but I received the entire $200,000 in savings with a special note for my Juliet's future dreams. Back then, my mother had been genuinely pleased for me, even helping me look into potential investments and discussing the type of business I may want to launch. That was prior to Rick. About 6 months ago, I became aware of my mother's behavioral changes for the first time. She began to postpone our weekly dinners, saying she had other commitments or was simply too exhausted. Rick would frequently be there when I dropped in unexpectedly, relaxing on our couch as if he owned the house. He would call me kiddo in a way that made my skin crawl and greet me with an embrace that was too familiar. He would remark, "Your mom's told me so much about you," with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "She's so proud of her successful daughter." However, I had just begun to notice subtle shifts in the way my mother spoke to me, small remarks about my spending patterns, inquiries about whether I really needed a flat when I could save money by staying at home. and hints that perhaps my job objectives were too ambitious. In retrospect, I recognized that Rick had most likely planted all of these insights. The most concerning aspect was the way my mother appeared to wane in his presence. The tough, self-reliant lady who had brought me up by herself had begun to submit to his views on everything, from what she should watch on TV to how she should spend her own money. She had even begun dressed differently, switching from her cozy nursing scrubs to the more exposing clothing he liked. I realized that the lady I had known and loved was vanishing as I sat in my mother's kitchen, and she explained why she was giving up my inheritance. My money wasn't merely taken by Rick. My mother had also been taken by him. However, I wasn't going to give up easily or let him win. That afternoon, my head was already whirling with potential outcomes as I left my mother's house. I was very upset by the treachery, but I also felt a frigid resolve that I received from my grandmother. I wouldn't recover my future by sitting around feeling sorry for myself, just as she hadn't developed her business by being inactive. I started by giving Mr. Harrison, my grandmother's attorney, a call. He had known our family since I was a toddler and had managed her affairs for more than 20 years. After I gave him the rundown, he responded, "Juliet, I'm so sorry to hear about this situation. Your grandmother was very specific about her wishes regarding that inheritance. Is there anything we can do legally?" Despite my suspicion that I already knew the answer, I inquired. "Regretfully, your mother technically had the authority to transfer the funds because she was the executor of the estate and you had already received them. But perhaps we can look at other possibilities." Our next meeting was set for the next day. I knew I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with as soon as I hung up. Rick may have won my mother over, but I suspected that his tearful tale of losing everything in a divorce might not be quite true. I conducted research that evening, as any competent marketing coordinator would. Court documents, company licenses, public data, and social media. I created a completely different picture of Rick Morrison by 2 in the morning than the one my mother had been sold. Rick was not a victim of his circumstances. Rather, he was a serial manipulator who frequently preyed on older ladies. Over the last 5 years, I've discovered 3 prior relationships that all followed the same pattern. He would use dating apps to connect with them, pose as a struggling contractor or small company owner, and gradually gain access to their money. He was the target of restraining orders from 2 of the ladies. The most intriguing was an 18-month-old civil lawsuit in which his ex-girlfriend successfully sued him for $15,000 that he had borrowed but never paid back. His strategies, which included financial manipulation, emotional abuse, and isolation, were clearly depicted in the court filings. His goal was to make his victims reliant on his approval. His business background, however, was what truly drew my interest. Rick stated that he was a contractor, however his only company registration was revoked due to non-payment of taxes. He lacked insurance, a contractor's license, and a reliable source of income. In essence, the individual my mother was helping was a skilled scammer. Equipped with this knowledge, I sensed that a strategy was starting to take shape. Rick had underestimated me, which was a critical error. He perceived a young lady who was debatable and dismissible. My grandma, however, had brought me up better than that. The remainder of the night was spent taking notes and getting ready for a battle that would be drastically different from what Rick had anticipated. I was going to teach him about the repercussions of stealing my fortune. The game was about to start, and I was going to be the one establishing the rules this time. What I thought was verified the next morning when I met with Mr. Harrison. Legally, I had few choices. Since she was listed as a backup beneficiary in case I passed away, my mother had, in theory, been allowed to transfer the funds. Rick had obviously studied and taken advantage of the weakness. However, Mr. Harrison stated, reclining in his leather chair, "Your grandmother's will has some intriguing provisions that may be relevant in this case." She was extremely worried about defending her legacy against fortune hunters, as she put it. He took out a heavy folder and started to read. "There's a provision that if the inheritance is used for purposes contrary to her stated wishes, specifically, if it's given to someone outside the family for personal gain, the executor can be held legally responsible for breach of fiduciary duty." My heart skipped a beat. What does that mean exactly? It implies that your mother could have to pay back the entire sum plus fines and court costs. However, we would have to demonstrate that Rick coerced her into making the transfer and that it contradicts your grandmother's stated objectives. I reflected on the research I had done the previous evening. What if I could prove that Rick has a history of financial manipulation and that he specifically targeted my mother for her assets? Mr. Harrison's brows went up. That would certainly strengthen our case considerably. Over the next 3 days, I continued to collect evidence. 2 of Rick's former victims consented to talk to me once I got in touch with them. I was witnessing the tragic parallels between their experiences and what was happening to my mother. Charm, seclusion, financial dependence, and finally exploitation were the same pattern. However, I need more than simply proof of Rick's prior actions. I had to capture him red-handed. At that point, I made the decision to surprise my mother with a visit. On Thursday night, I brought takeaway from her favorite restaurant to her place, and we had a well-planned talk. We sat at her kitchen table, and I told her, "I've been thinking about what you said. Maybe you're right about Rick needing a fresh start." My mom's expression brightened with relief. "Oh, Juliet, I'm so happy you get it. You despise Rick because he has been so concerned." "Not at all," I said, lying with ease. "To be honest, I'd really like to know him better. This weekend, perhaps the 3 of us might get together for supper." I neglected to disclose that I had already made arrangements for a private investigator to keep an eye on the residence. Rick would soon start requesting more money if he was the scammer I thought he was. It started with the inheritance. As it turned out, Rick was astonished but happy to see me come home an hour later. "Your mother mentioned you were unhappy about the financial situation, Juliet." With his rehearsed smile, he replied, "I hope there are no hard feelings." "Of course not," went my response. "Family takes care of family, right?" The ensuing discussion was instructive. Rick had obviously been carefully considering his next course of action. In passing, he highlighted a few investment opportunities he was investigating, home remodeling projects that would increase the property value, and a company idea that would set them up for life. Every recommendation called for using more of my mother's funds. The thing is, opportunities like this don't come around very often, but they do require some capital to get started, Rick stated, his tone becoming more solemn. As she waited for him to finish speaking, my mother was already figuring out in her head how much she might withdraw from her retirement funds. I witnessed this manipulation firsthand, observing how deftly Rick used her feelings and her want to offer assistance. However, what transpired after Rick used the restroom was what truly cemented my determination. "I think Rick might pop the question soon," my mother said in a whisper as she leaned across the table. "He has made hints that he wants to formally announce things." The parts came together with a click. My inheritance wasn't the only issue here. Rick intended to wed my mother in order to inherit all she had, including her home, pension, and life insurance. Everything my grandma had fought so hard to achieve was being methodically destroyed by a predator. I returned home that evening and made my plan final. Rick intended to manipulate the destiny of my family? All right. However, he was going to discover that certain games had unanticipated repercussions. My plan's next step called for accuracy and patience. For the next week, I pretended to be the helpful daughter, supporting my mother's choices and even volunteering to assist Rick with his business research. He was unaware that every chat was being meticulously recorded. Janet, my private investigator who specialized in fraud cases, had been hard at work collecting proof of Rick's actions. She found out that in addition to his pursuit of my mother, he had been seeing 2 other women in neighboring cities at the same time. In order to fit what he believed each lady wanted to hear, Rick would portray himself as a different kind of struggling professional in each relationship. When we met at a downtown coffee shop, Janet said, "He's running what we call a long-term romance scam." The majority of people consider these to be simple internet scams, but Rick's is more complex. Before making his financial decisions, he spends months fostering emotional dependence. She gave me a packet with bank data and surveillance photographs. The good news is that he is predictable due to his routine. Your mother is already deeply involved, which is bad news. The evidence was overwhelming. In order to finance his other connections, including booking hotel rooms and lavish dinners with his other targets, Rick had been utilizing the money from my inheritance. In an apparent attempt to accrue debt in my mother's name, he had also begun applying for credit cards using her address. However, a recorded phone call between Rick and one of his other targets, a Savannah widow named Patricia, provided the most incriminating proof. With Patricia's help, Janet was able to get the recording, and Rick's remarks chilled me to the bone. Rick said, "The nurse is completely hooked," in a clear voice. "I've persuaded her that her daughter is ungrateful and self-centered. The home, the pension, and the life insurance will all be mine by Christmas. After then, I can stop talking to the daughter altogether, and everything will be okay." The last piece of evidence I needed was hearing him call my mother, the nurse, while he was plotting to ruin our relationship. It was more than simply thievery. It was a planned assault on our whole family. I started the second part of my strategy that weekend. I said I wanted to appropriately commemorate my mother and Rick's relationship by inviting them to dinner at a fancy restaurant. They were unaware that I had extended an invitation to another person to join us. When the private investigator showed up at our table, I said, "Mom, Rick, I'd like you to meet my friend Janet. She's been helping me with some research for a work project." Rick's face turned a little pale, but he remained calm. "Janet, nice to meet you. What sort of study?" Janet took the seat next to my mother and remarked, "Actually, I specialize in investigating fraud cases," with a charming tone. "Juliet asked me to look into some concerning financial activities in the area." Rick's face completely lost its color. With a bewildered expression, my mother glanced between Janet and me with increasing concern. "I don't understand," she murmured. "What does this have to do with us?" I took the folder that Janet had handed me out of my handbag. "Mom, there's something you need to know about Rick's background." One of the most challenging talks of my life ensued. As Janet carefully went over the evidence, the prior victims, the court cases, the ongoing investigations in other cities, I saw my mother's expression shift. Rick sat still, obviously trying to figure out if he could still save the day. When he eventually exclaimed, "This is ridiculous," his charm broke. "Juliet is obviously jealous of our relationship, and she's making this all up." However, my mother was not a fool, and the evidence was self-evident. She wasn't blind, but she had been tricked. The revelation of the tape discussion by Janet was the actual shock. I watched as 20 years of my mother's nursing expertise kicked in as Rick's voice filled the diner, detailing his plans to isolate my mother and steal all my grandma had fought so hard to achieve. She was susceptible to emotional manipulation, yet she was able to spot predators. Rick stormed off at the end of the restaurant scene, saying we were all insane and that we would regret teasing him. Sitting in startled silence, my mother tried to comprehend the truth of what she had been lured into. The night was far from ended, however. As we waited in Janet's car outside the restaurant, my mother said softly, "There's more, isn't there?" I gave a nod. "We have to see the police tonight, Mom. Rick has been applying for credit using your information, and there is proof that he intends to commit more financial crimes." The most unsettling aspect of Janet's inquiry was what I hadn't yet disclosed to my mother. Rick was more than simply a scammer. When his plans were jeopardized, he had a history of using violence. Charges had been dropped when the ladies were too scared to testify, but 2 of his past victims had been hospitalized after confronting him. Rick's actions were previously known to Detective Williams of the Charleston Police Department. It appears that they had been assembling evidence against him for months in order to secure a conviction. As we sat at the police station at 10 p.m., Detective Williams said, "Your mother's case could be the key we need. If she's willing to cooperate, we can add her testimony to what we already have from his other victims." I was shocked at my mother's power. She persisted on delivering a full statement that evening, despite the emotional pain of understanding how completely she had been duped. Because she wanted to believe in love, she described every financial transaction, every manipulative strategy, and every warning sign that she had disregarded. She said, "I feel so stupid," when we eventually left for home at 2 in the morning. "Mom, you're not foolish. You have faith. There is a distinction." However, the true drama was only getting started. Rick arrived at my mother's place the following morning and demanded access. He was unaware that everything was being filmed by the security cameras that Janet's crew had set up the night before. You think you can just destroy my life? Through the front door, Rick yelled. I am aware of your workplace and the residence of your beloved daughter. This is not the end. The cops needed the threats to take him into custody right away. By midday, Rick had been taken into custody and Detective Williams had been at my mother's house to go over the accusations, which included identity theft, financial fraud, criminal threats, and breaking a restraining order from his former Savannah victim. Detective Williams said, we also found evidence on his phone of communications with known check fraud operations, according to his notes. The extent of Rick's illegal activity was astounding. He has been involved in more than simply romantic frauds. He had been a member of a wider financial crime syndicate that operated in 3 different states. Money from my inheritance had been used to finance fraudulent business ventures and check-kiting activities. The good news, Detective Williams went on, is that we have recovered the majority of the money. Rick likely intended to utilize it as seed money for larger scams, which is why it was still in accounts under his control. I received my inheritance back at the end of the week, along with the interest and damages Rick had agreed to pay as part of his plea deal. His whole network was being dismantled, and he faced 15 years in federal jail. Beyond the cash, however, something more significant had been brought back. Hours passed as my mother and I discussed what had transpired, how Rick had exploited our relationship, and how we might mend the broken trust. My mother said, your grandmother would be proud of how you handled this, as we went over Rick's possessions that the police had returned to her. I reflected on my grandmother's statement that the only things that no one could take away were education and freedom. She had been correct, but I also learned something else from her. Fighting for what you love is sometimes the greatest way to keep it safe. My phone rang 3 weeks after Rick was arrested when I was working at Amberlin Ventures. My mother's number appeared on the caller ID. However, I was surprised to hear tears when I responded. My mother cried and said, Juliet, I'm so sorry. I really apologize for what I caused you to go through. I ought to have paid attention to you right away. That morning, when my mother got the final police report outlining the entire scope of Rick's misdeeds, she had an emotional breakthrough. She discovered that as part of a methodical strategy to take complete control of her life, he had been preparing to forge her will, had already stolen her identity to create credit accounts, and had been progressively separating from me. The detective said, if you hadn't acted when you did, I could have lost everything, she went on. My relationship with you, my pension, and the house. In an attempt to save my daughter from a guy who intended to ruin us both, I nearly lost her. Her voice carried the weight of awareness, and I could hear it. It wasn't simply money that Rick had stolen. He had come very close to ruining our entire family. I responded softly, Mom, you don't have to apologize. You were manipulated by someone who makes a living exploiting people's capacity for love. She wasn't done, though. I want you to be aware that I'm receiving therapy. In order to prevent this from happening again, I want to know how I allowed it to happen. And I'm going to correct this. I swear. The ensuing discussion was the most candid we had had in years. My mother talked to me about how lonely she had been ever since my father left, and how Rick had given her a sense of worth and desire that she hadn't had in decades. She also acknowledged that Rick had skillfully used her jealousy of my success and independence to put a gap between us. He knew exactly what to say to make me feel like you were moving away from me, she said. He made me believe that taking your inheritance was a way of keeping you close, of making you need your family again. I had underestimated the sophistication of the deception. Rick had been playing a lengthy game, posing as my mother's provider and protector while manipulating her innermost anxieties and insecurities to turn her against me. The community saw repercussions from Rick's fallout that I hadn't expected. Detective Williams got in touch with me to let me know that they had identified and aided 12 additional victims in 3 states thanks to our case. Rick was a member of a network that was methodically destroyed, and over $1.2 million in damages were recovered. However, the financial recovery was not the only human consequence. Together, my mother and I started going to family counseling in an effort to mend the communication and trust that Rick had ruined. We learned how predators like Rick recognize and take advantage of family dynamics from the challenging yet therapeutic sessions. According to our counselor, manipulators look for existing cracks in relationships. They don't cause issues. they intensify those that are already there. I was taken aback by my mother's resolve to turn her experience into something constructive. She started helping with a neighborhood group that assisted victims of elder abuse, offering support and information by drawing on her own experience and nursing skills. As we were getting ready for her first presentation, she told me, "I want other women to recognize the warning signs I missed. If sharing my story can save even one family from what we went through, then maybe some good can come from this nightmare." In the meantime, I was thinking back on the courage and independence teachings my grandma had given me. She had persevered through immigration, established a company, and brought up a family. I had fought back, channeling her energy, when someone tried to erase that heritage. When the inheritance funds were eventually sent back to my account, something seemed off. My grandmother's gift was no longer the only one. It served as a representation of tenacity, unbreakable familial ties, and the value of sticking up for your convictions. In keeping with my grandmother's wishes, I chose to utilize a portion of it to launch my own marketing firm that focuses on assisting small companies in establishing genuine connections with their local communities. It felt appropriate to construct something based on honesty and trust with funds that had almost been stolen via deceit. For his actions, Rick Morrison was given a 15-year federal sentence, the first 8 of which were without the possibility of parole. His fellow members of the financial fraud syndicate were sentenced to 5 to 12 years in prison. In particular, the judge pointed out that Rick's deliberate targeting of weaker women demonstrated a heartless disrespect for human decency, which called for the harshest punishment. He lost the ability to get in touch with any of his victims when his appeals were rejected. The 3 ladies he had been coercing at the same time were all fully compensated, and 2 of them founded a romance scam support group that currently serves hundreds of individuals throughout the Southeast. As I reflected on those months of betrayal and healing, I came to the conclusion that the money my grandmother gave me wasn't her greatest gift. She had given me the courage and insight to stand up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible to prevail.